Hello everybody, welcome to BYJU'S 6th, 7th and 8th grade channel. I'm your teacher Aishwarya and I welcome you to this particular video where we are going to be summarizing the chapter Reaching the Age of Adolescence, and that too under 30 minutes. So I hope that all of you are excited for this class. If you are, don't forget to hit the like button on this video and do not forget to hit the subscribe button on the channel. Now of course, please understand that this particular video we are only going to summarize the chapter. In case if you want an in-depth concept explanation, please check out the description of this video where you will find the link to the one shot of this chapter where we have covered all the concepts in great detail. So students, when you're watching this video, I hope that you have your notebooks, textbooks, everything ready so that you can write down the important pointers as and when we discuss. Let's get started without wasting any more time. Now we're talking about the chapter Reaching the Age of Adolescence. And to be honest, this chapter right here is a continuation of our previous chapter which deals with the concept of reproduction. Now when we talk about reproduction, we know that it is the process by which living organisms make young ones of their own kind. And we have two kinds of reproduction. We have a sexual mode of reproduction and we have sexual mode of reproduction. Now, when you talk about sexual mode of reproduction, we know that there are two gametes which are involved. So we have a male gamete and there's a female gamete which come together, fuse to form a single cell structure called as zygote. Now, this zygote will further undergo development, giving rise to a young individual. Now, this baby right there would start its lifespan or start its life journey and will undergo various phases of life, where from it'll, as soon as the baby is delivered, it will enter infancy, followed by which the baby will grow and develop and enter childhood. From childhood, it will enter into its teenage years or the adolescence phase, then into adulthood, or in this case, early adulthood. Now, of course, from here, it will then move on, or the individuals will move on into middle age and finally old age. Now, one thing you need to understand is that every living organism has a fixed lifespan. But we know that with the help of reproduction, there is continuity of species. So when do human beings become capable in order to reproduce? So that is the question that we are going to answer in this session. Now, if you look at it, adolescence is the period where our body actually attains this reproductive maturity. So if you think about it, we see that during infancy and childhood, our body is physically growing. It is incapable of reproducing in those periods of time. But once the individual enters into adolescence, right, we see that adolescence is a time period where the body undergoes a lot of changes leading to reproductive maturity. So we see that adolescence is the entire time span. But the point of life, right, or the point at which, let's say, this individual or this individual attains that reproductive maturity or reaches that time span where the body undergoes changes, we call that as puberty. So we often have a misunderstanding between what is puberty and what is adolescence. But now I hope we are clear with it, right? Puberty is the point of life from which our body starts to undergo reproductive changes, or we can say it starts to undergo changes leading to reproductive maturity. Now this puberty can happen at different points of life for different people. So we see that for some it would be at the age of 10, some it would be at the age of 12, some at the age of 13, some in rare cases at the age of 14. So now in all these cases, it is all dependent on multiple factors. A lot of chemicals in our body are involved in bringing about these changes, which is why there is no uniform time of life for every individual. Yes? So now we have understood the difference between adolescence and puberty. Now we have understood that the body is undergoing various changes. Now what are these changes? Changes can be broadly classified into three. We have physical changes, there are emotional or intellectual changes, and last but not the least, we see that there are sexual changes. So what are the physical changes that we see? Now in individuals who are undergoing reproductive maturity, we see that there's change in height, voice, body shape and acne. or development of acne, I would say. Now, if you look at it, changes happen in both males as well as in females, right? So changes happen in both males and females. Now, if you look at height, we see that during puberty or during this particular adolescence phase, we see that there is increase in height. Now we see that during this time, girls tend to grow faster when compared to boys, but nonetheless, both of them experience a growth spurt where they grow suddenly, right? There's increase in height suddenly. So when I say suddenly, it doesn't mean that in overnight it's something that happens, but I would say in a shorter period of time. And we see that both men and males and females will attain their maximum height by the age of 18, or let's say by 21 years. Now, maximum height again depends from individual to individual based on their genetic constitution. Next, of course, there is change in body shape. Now, what happens during this time? We see that in males, their body changes where they end up getting wide, broad shoulders, while females, we see that there is widening in the hip region. Now, this is because the development of the young one takes place inside the female body. And we see that in order to accommodate this, we see that the females have this kind of a body shape. Moving on to voice. Now, during this time, there is development of the voice box or the larynx, as a result of which boys end up getting a deep, hoarse voice, or in some case, a deep, pitched voice, I would say. Now, along with this, we also see that there is a protrusion that develops in the neck region, which is called as the Adam's apple. Now, in females, we see that the Adam's apple is absent and their voice is a little more high-pitched. Now, last is something which is development of acne and pimples. Now, this is common in both boys and girls, right? And we see that this is because of the increased activity of sweat and sebaceous glands. Now, what are sebaceous glands? Sebaceous glands are oil-producing glands, right? Now, this oil is what we call as sebum. And we see that naturally it is needed for giving us the natural glow that is there in our skin. But now there is increased activity of this sebaceous glands, which leads to clogging of pores. Sometimes, it could mix with some bacteria, resulting in the formation of acne and pimples. And it's all very common during this period, which is why there's nothing to be ashamed about, nothing to feel that, oh my God, I have a lot of pimples on my face. It's absolutely normal. It will all become okay, right? It's a part of the changes that happen within our body. Now, next up, of course, we have the intellectual changes, where individuals start to become a little more independent than before, more self-conscious. They tend to make their own decisions by thinking and being more reasonable. And along this time, we also see that the brain has greater capacity for learning, which is why they say that during these years are the best time to learn new things, right? And of course, to understand what goes in and around us. Last, of course, we have the sexual changes. Now, sexual changes are those changes which happen to the reproductive organs. Now, sexual changes, right, we see that there are two. So, we see that when you look at sexual changes or sexual characteristics, we see that we have primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics. Now, what do I mean by primary, secondary sexual characteristic? So, if there is an individual, we know that the individual will be termed as a male if he has a male reproductive organ or a male gonad or the testis. And if there is a female, we can primarily identify by what kind of reproductive organ that person is having. So if the person has an ovary, then that person is biologically a female. Now, in this case, what happens is that during adolescence period, there is development of sex organs that happens. So in case of males, testis and the external genitalia develop, we see that the testis will actively start producing the male gamete or the sperms. While in the case of females, we see that the ovary start to develop, where the ovaries start to develop and the ova or the eggs start to undergo maturation, and they start releasing the ova by the process of ovulation. Now, along with this, we have secondary changes or secondary sexual characteristics as well. Now, what are secondary sexual characteristics? These are the observable features, right? These are the observable features by which I am able to identify an individual as a male. Maybe by what I see on the outside. For example, if there is facial hair, there is chest hair, right? So these are all ways in which we can identify a male. Now, along with this, we also see that there is growth of hair in the armpit region and in the pubic region. And that is something that we see both in males and females. Now, in the case of females, a secondary sexual characteristic is the development of breasts or mammary glands. Now, mammary glands are the milk-producing glands. And these are essential especially because once the baby is born, the milk is produced in the mammary glands, which is why these are some secondary sexual characteristics we observe in females. Now, all these changes that I discussed with you are controlled and regulated by something called as hormones. So, what are hormones? Hormones are nothing but they are chemical messengers. So, they are released by a group of specialized cells called as glands, right? So, they are released by a group of cells. What is their role? Their function is to secrete certain substances. Now, what do? They directly pour it into the blood. There is no specific tube that will take it to where it has to reach. It will pour it directly into the bloodstream, which is why we call them such glands as endocrine glands. Now, what is the job of a hormone? As the name suggests, it is a chemical messenger. So, if we have to say that, let's say there is growth spurt that is happening or increase in height that is happening, which means somebody needs to instruct the bone cells of our body or the bones to start elongating so that increase in height can happen. In such cases, if there is more various metabolic activities that need to happen, somebody needs to instruct the body that hey, you have to do that. So these instructions or these messages are passed by the hormones. And it's not that every hormone can have an impact on every part of the body. Each hormone has a specific target cell or a target site where the information has to go, which is why we see that hormones have this particular ability. So quickly, if you think about it, hormones are produced by endocrine glands, which are also known as ductless glands. And we see that they produce specific chemicals that are released into the bloodstream, and they are responsible for regulating growth, development, and metabolism in the body. Now, some of the endocrine glands that are there in our body include the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, adrenal gland, pancreas, ovary, and testes. Yes, the reproductive organs act as endocrine glands, right? So now in this particular case, if you see, the pituitary gland that is there is called as the master gland of our body. Now the master gland, of course, means that they produce hormones that control the functioning of other endocrine glands. But apart from that, we see that it also produces growth hormone that regulates growth. Now, next up, we have thyroid gland. Now, thyroid gland produces thyroxine, which is responsible for regulating the metabolism that happens in our body. So, carbohydrate, protein, fat metabolism is all regulated by thyroxine. Now, next up, we have adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland that is there produces adrenaline. And this adrenaline is what is normally produced when we experience a stressful situation or a situation where we are feeling very nervous. So, it instigates a fight or flight response. So, for example, if I'm being chased by a dog or I'm on a roller coaster, I am experiencing a lot of emotions where I feel my breathing rate is more, my heart is beating faster. So all of that is triggered by the adrenal gland and the hormone it produces. Last, we have the pancreas, which produces insulin and glucagon, which regulates the blood sugar levels of our body. Now, the two very important hormones that is important for us on an examination point of view are the testes and the ovary. Now, testes produces the male sex hormone called as testosterone. Now, what is the function of testosterone? They regulate the functioning of the male secondary sexual characters, and they are also playing a very important role in the development of testes and the production of sperms. While on the other hand, we see that ovary produces two kinds of hormones. It produces estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen here is responsible for regulating the, release of ovum, which is also called as ovulation, and of course regulating the female secondary sexual characters. While progesterone is often called as the pregnancy hormone, and their main function is, to help with the pregnancy process or once fertilization has happened. So we see that the functions of the male and female sex hormones are very important, especially on an examination point of view. Now, last but not the least, we will go on to the reproductive phase in human beings. Now, what is a reproductive phase? So we've understood that during the adolescence phase, our body has started to undergo various changes, and all of this is to attain reproductive maturity. So the period of time, right? So the period of time when the individual is capable of reproducing or producing a young one is what we call as the reproductive phase. Now, if you look at females, right, we see that the reproductive phase starts at puberty, which means starts at about 10-12 years and will end by 40 to 50 years. So we see that this particular phase is what we call as the reproductive phase. Now, why is it so? Why is it that reproductive phase in females end by 45-50 years? So for this, we need to go back a little bit and learn about the reproduction process. So now we know that both males and females have the main reproductive organs. And in the female reproductive system, we see that the ovary have many eggs or ova. Now what you need to understand is that when the female is in, developing inside her mother's womb, there is a fixed number of eggs which are produced by the body then only when the female is in the mother's body. So the ova or the number of eggs are fixed. There cannot be more, there cannot be more which can be produced. So what will happen? They will reach a certain phase of development and they will stop. And we see that once the female enters reproduction, the ova will then undergo maturation. Which is why I never said that there is production of ova, but rather there is maturation of the egg. But that's not the case for males. Males produce sperms and they can continue producing sperms, right? There's no fixed number of sperms that they end up producing. Now what happens is that every month, once the female has attained reproductive maturity, the eggs will start to mature, right? And every month, we see that one egg is released by one ovary. And this process of release of egg is what we call as ovulation. Now, why does it release the egg? So that it can fertilize the egg and make the young one, right? And we know that fertilization is nothing but process of fusion. Now, when this process is happening in the female reproductive tract, I'll just draw one side of it. Now, along this time, the uterus that is there, right? The uterus will also prepare itself to receive the fertilized egg. So what will it do? The inner linings of the uterus will start to get thickened with blood and mucus. Now, this particular phenomenon happens so that it can receive the fertilized egg. But it's not always that every time fertilization is going to happen. Chances are fertilization does not happen. So then in that case, what will happen if fertilization does not happen? So in such a case, we see that the inner linings of the uterus, that means all this thickening of blood and mucus will be shed off along with the unfertilized egg. So this phenomenon of shedding of the inner lining of the uterus, which has blood and mucus along with the unfertilized egg, is called as menstruation. And we see that it is a cyclic process that happens every month. Because it is a cyclic process, we call it as the menstrual cycle that happens every 28 days in females. So we see that once menstruation happens, we see that again, the next egg will start to undergo maturation, the uterine lining will continue thickening, and then ovulation will happen. Now, if fertilization does not happen, then we know that it will lead to menstruation. So going back, if you see, the first menstrual cycle that happens, or we see that the reproductive phase, or we say that a girl has entered into her reproductive phase when the first menstruation happens. And this first menstruation that happens at puberty is what we call as menarche. And then it is a cyclic process that happens every month. But like I said, because there's a fixed number of eggs, we see that eventually by 45-50, we see that this process will tend to stop. So we call this as the menopause, where further beyond this, menstruation will not occur, thereby indicating the cessation, that means the ending of the reproductive phase, which means that after this, the woman cannot conceive, right? So this is a very important topic again from an examination point of view. So now I hope we are clear. Now we will move on to the last super important concept, which is sex determination, which means that now we know that individuals are biologically men or women. But what determines the sex of the individual? Now in human beings, we know that we have a total of 46 chromosomes in every cell, right? Which means that we have 23 pairs. Now the first 22 pairs or the first 44 are the same both in males and females. But the last pair, right? So the 23rd pair is slightly different. Yes. So we see that the 23rd pair in males is a XY pair, while in females, we see that it is a XX pair. Which is why what happens during gamete formation, the number of chromosomes will become half. So we see that in gametes, they will not have 46 chromosomes, but they will have only half the number. So we see that in females, all the eggs will end up having 22 plus X. So if you do it as 44 plus XX, it will divide and give us 22 plus X. But now the condition comes in males, because males have XY combination. So that is why some sperms will end up having 22 plus X, while some will have 22 plus Y. So during fertilization process, what will happen? Based on which sperm fuses with the egg, it will determine the sex of the individual. So if the sperm having X chromosome fuses with the egg, then the young one or the zygote will develop into a baby girl. While if the sperm having Y chromosome fuses with the egg, then it will be a boy. So hence we can say that the sex of the baby depends upon the sex chromosome that is present in the male gamete. Or we can say that the father determines the sex of the individual. So with this, everybody, we've covered the major topic of sex determination. The last concept, of course, is that of reproductive health, where we need to make sure that we maintain healthy reproductive organs and ensure that we are physically, mentally taking care of it, and of course ensuring that we are being hygienic in all aspects. So during adolescence, since our body is undergoing a lot of changes, it is important to eat the right kind of food and have a balanced diet. And along with that, because there is increased activity of sweat and sebaceous glands, it is important that we ensure that we take bath regularly, wash our face regularly, wash our hands regularly, and be hygienic. So along with this, we see that because our skin can tend to get oily, it's important that regular baths, clean clothes, all of this is highly recommended. So we keep our body clean and healthy. So with this, everybody, we come to the end of this particular summary class. So I hope that all of you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to let me know in the comments below. And very quickly, I have a homework question for all of you. So in the comments below, can you tell me what are the sex chromosomes present in the father? Yes, let me know the answer in the comments of this video. And hey, guess what? For extra practice, we've also added a small Google form test in the comments of this video, and you'll be able to find it in the description. So go ahead and check that out as well. And I hope that you find it helpful. So thank you so much, everybody, for staying with me till the very end. I hope to see you all soon. But up until then, take care. Lots of love to all of you, and bye-bye.